Breaking news. The Russian-featured economic forum has become a scam. St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, SPIEF, used to be known as the Russian Davos, but each year it draws fewer foreign participants. Vladimir Putin's keynote address was once viewed as an economic roadmap and indicator of the Russian president's mood by investors and foreign media. Neither Western media nor investors were present this year, and as the Ukrainian counteroffensive begins amid Russia's shelling of its border regions, what matters most is not what Putin said, but rather what he didn't say. Over 25 years ago, SPIEF was conceived as a way to promote the Russian economy to international investors. The presence of international guests at the forum was given special attention in order to demonstrate Russia's integration into the global community through their participation. The forum continued to be an important international event after the 2014 annexation of Crimea, with representatives from BP, Royal Dutch Shell, Philips, Total, Eni, Telenor Group, and Glencore all in attendance. Russia's status as a guest nation whose leader always spoke at the plenary session with Putin was maintained by the world's leading powers. Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India held this position in 2017, President Emmanuel Macron of France in 2018, and President Xi Jinping of China in 2019. However, things quickly went downhill when Russia invaded Ukraine on a grand scale. Egypt was the invited country last year, and President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi gave a video address instead of making the trip. Putin was joined at the event only by Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, while a delegation from the Taliban regime in Afghanistan received the bulk of the press coverage. Some Russian business leaders stayed away from the forum this year, too. Foreign countries and companies, including those from the Global South, where Russia has ostensibly redirected its attention, were represented at a level well below the ministerial one. Journalists from unfriendly countries were not invited, and Western guests didn't bother to show up. While the UAE served as the invited nation, Algeria's president joined Putin on stage during his plenary address. The president of Russia delivered a speech whose content was completely predictable. Despite thousands of sanctions, he naturally started by praising Russia's growing GDP. He also highlighted the historically low unemployment rate and the, lower in Russia than in many Western countries, inflation rate. Putin soon grew bored with economic routing and returned to his usual fare of talking about neo-Nazis running the Ukrainian state and making veiled nuclear threats against the West. What was left unsaid, however, was far more significant than the bravado on display. Such evidence includes the fact that defense spending has been Russia's primary source of economic growth this year and that the military-industrial complex has been at the forefront of industrial expansion for the past several months, dragging the entire manufacturing sector along with it. The Russian military-industrial complex expanded by 25% in the first quarter of 2023, with particularly rapid expansion in the navigation device and protective clothing markets. Budgetary spending on the military-industrial complex is a clear drain on resources, and its elimination would immediately halt economic growth. Predictably, the president also avoided talking about Russia's continued reliance on imports. After initially reporting a $6.8 billion surplus in April's international trade, the government later revised its estimate to $2.3 billion. The results of this trend are a decline in Russia's export earnings and a sharp increase in the country's imports. In addition, Russia's international trade is increasingly conducted in yuan. The ruble accounted for 38% of exports and 28% of imports in April, while the yuan accounted for a record 23% and 31%, respectively. Therefore, when purchasing goods abroad, Russia is already losing money in yuan terms. The Russian government's elation over the country's historically low unemployment rate is largely attributable to the fact that there aren't enough people living in Russia to fill available jobs. Two waves of emigration among white-collar workers, one after the war broke out and another after the announcement of partial mobilization in September 2022, have compounded the already severe personnel shortage. Construction sites on occupied Ukrainian territory pay upwards of 200,000 rubles per month, nearly $2,500, which is 3 times the national average, making it difficult for civilian enterprises to attract and retain blue-collar workers. The typical civilian sector cannot afford to offer such high wages, which is eroding the workforce. The paradoxical result is an overheating economy in a country at war. Price increases are occurring as a result of rising demand and a stagnant domestic supply of goods and services. The government agency in charge of inflation has already announced that they expect no seasonal deflation and are therefore preparing to increase interest rates. While the budget was balanced in May, the president did not mention that the government has racked up a deficit of 3.4 trillion rubles, more than $40 billion, since the beginning of the year and is therefore desperately fighting for every kopeck, sometimes at the expense of long-term plans. It is not a sign of social responsibility that Finance Minister Anton Silwanov says the 300 billion ruble windfall tax on businesses will go to help families with children. The government will squeeze every penny out of the economy as oil and gas revenues decline. While the Russian government has been talking a good game about the economy's long-term viability and growth, its officials have retrained themselves to focus on the immediate future. Meanwhile, investors favor long-term planning horizons regardless of their country of origin. Putin and his ministers' excessive optimism reeks of attempts to convince themselves, not so much mythical investors, as it does with their threats to unleash nuclear war. No reasonable investor would believe this talk of economic prosperity in light of the ongoing carnage in Ukraine, the threats of nuclear retaliation, and the public feuding between Russian mercenaries and the Russian Defense Ministry. Once a prestigious investment forum, SPIEF has, after 25 years, become a podium for an aging autocrat who, for some reason, believes everything is going according to plan.